I'd like to start by giving you two Shakespearean quotes which have some relevance to the central theme of my address this evening. The first, of course, comes from Julius Caesar, that famous reference concerning evil. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often certainly bad. Evil does survive over generations. And the other quotation, of course, is one I'm sure most of you are familiar with: "A rose by any other name smells just sweet." Well, if I could turn that around, irrespective of what description we have of what I'm going to call evil, doesn't change the reality at all. Part of our problem is this question of terminology, and so we've had in recent times a lot of discussion about what's called Fabianism, Fabian society, Fabian social society. And I'm often asked, was, for example, a former Liberal Prime Minister, was he a Fabian? Short answer is, of course, here that we've got to ask, what are we talking about? Some of the most influential communists throughout history, perhaps in the Western world, were never members of the Communist Party. Never members of the Communist Party. But they were much more effective in the roles they played because they weren't part of that formal structure. What I'm saying here is that large numbers of people do not belong to a formal structure, but nevertheless they are very deeply tainted, unconscious otherwise, with a particular type of disease. Many years ago, when I used to conduct a lot of seminars concerning communism, we used to discuss this question of those people who didn't of themselves have the disease but spread the disease. And I used to use that analogy of typhoid. I well recall going to Scotland once where they had an outbreak, or they had a bad outbreak of typhoid, and I first saw this term typhoidneary, and I wondered who they were. Well, they were people who didn't actually have typhoid themselves, but they spread it. They carried it. They were carriers. And so our society is really full of people who are carriers of ideas, diseases, while they themselves may argue and genuinely believe they don't have it, but they're certainly spreading it. At the moment, for example, we've got a manifestation of this disease in the field of the debate, as it's called, concerning republicanism. And perhaps you've noticed this. According to the media, very learned people, those who write editorials, it's inevitable. It's inevitable. The doctrine of inevitability. That's a very deadly disease, a deadly idea. Deadly because if people are victims of it, it paralyzes them completely. Inevitability. Some people are quite horrified if you tell them, well, look, you're just simply putting forward the old Marxist idea. The Marxist idea was that Marxism was historically inevitable. If it's historically inevitable, well, there's nothing much you can do about it. And that's what, of course, some people want you to accept, because that neutralizes. You don't take any effective action. So if we get into this area, we can see that we've got to get right behind labels and look at ideas and what those ideas are about. Because history has been dominated by ideas. So I'd have to say at the moment, as far as what we call the Fabian society, the formal structure is concerned, its membership, as far as I can ascertain, is not particularly great. In fact, it may be that eventually the Fabian society as an organisation will disappear. But that doesn't mean that the ideas advanced by that society are going to disappear. They may well re-emerge in a different form, with a different label on. For example, now starting with this word called Fabianism, where did it originate? Well, it originated late last century in England with a group of so-called intellectuals who in essence said the English people wouldn't accept a certain idea or set of ideas if labelled Marxism or communism, but if we label it Fabianism, that'll sound very learned and people will accept that. The term Fabian, of course, is derived from a very famous Roman general, Fabius Maximus, who carried the nickname of Cantata the Delayer. Now, he was involved in a whole series of wars at that time called the Punic Wars against Hannibal. And his strategy was rather different from others. He believed in delay. He believed in drawing out. He believed in the indirect approach. Until he reached that stage, he felt he could take decisive action. To steady the slow process, not the direct process. And so that indicates the approach the Fabians were going to adopt towards advancing these ideas. It's that old story I've often told, it's worth repeating because I think it makes a point concerning the frog. If you take a frog, a nice, live, healthy one that's difficult to hold in the hand, and you toss that frog into boiling water, immediately his reflexes result in a jump to safety. But take that same frog and put him in cold water, where it starts to swim around quite happily, and then you proceed to increase the temperature of the water slowly, not too rapidly. He keeps adjusting himself, but never reaches the stage of jumping until eventually you can boil him alive. We're rather like the frog. The temperature of the water in many areas has steadily increased. Many people are beginning to feel at the moment the water's getting a bit hot, but you never make that definite decision it's time to jump. So the Fabian thinking is gradual. That's one of their key utility terms, gradual. So I want you to just think about that because it's important to the general thesis I'm going to develop here tonight. So we don't get confused with labels, don't make silly mistakes, don't make silly allegations. So for example, if someone says to me, as they have, was Malcolm Fraser or some other liberal a Fabian, I have to say, well, I've got no evidence he was a member of the Fabian Society, but many of them are badly afflicted with the disease, in fact, much more so than some of those that are a member of the Fabian Society. It's the history of ideas, then, that I want to discuss with you tonight, because I stress this is essential for our survival. There are certain constants that run through the human drama. There are what I call absolutes. Now, I know the word absolute is not a very popular word at the moment because we're a liberated people. We don't believe in absolutes anymore. We believe you can compromise, you can shift, you can change, particularly if you put another label on something, and apparently then becomes quite different. But there's several absolutes I think we need to look at. Number one, of course, is that absolute concerning power. Well, you're all familiar with the famous statement by the great Lord Acton about all power tending to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, that's just as absolute as the law of gravity. What I call the liberal disease, the small L liberal disease, manifests itself by the observation that it ought not to do that. People should be so basically good, that they never become corrupted by power. The reality is, of course, they do. Always. And I don't care who they are, that's the end result. It's a manifestation to me of real evil in the sense that the individual is deprived of, I believe, his inalienable right to control his own destiny. And somebody says, if you use the word evil, and I don't see much manifestation of that, well, again, that's the problem. The difference between labels and the reality. You're all familiar with that very pleasant person called the do-gooder. You've all met the do-gooder, haven't you? The do-gooder only wants to do good to you, whether you want it done to you or not. And they're very pleasant about it. So, for example, they may believe that we're not looking after our children well enough, their teeth are in bad state, and it's been scientifically proved if we dose everybody with fluoride, their teeth will improve. So therefore, the do-gooder says, well, parents are quite irresponsible, you can't trust them. Let's fluoridate the public water supply, form a collectivism. And most of those people are quite pleasant people. And all they want is just enough power to do good to you. Once they take that first step, we're on the road to hell. Really. Again, going back to Shakespeare, where he says, of course, how evil can be masked, so often masked by lovely terms. And I often tell the story here, which perhaps some of you have heard before, but forgive me, of that famous Russian judge under the Soviet system. As a man, he was a most pleasant fellow, very cultured man. He read all the great classics. He didn't listen to the Beatles or any stuff like that. He played classical music. Occasionally he could be seen walking in the gardens, admiring nature, the birds. They even patted the little children on the heads he went past. He was what a lovely man. Same judge, in his role as a functionary of the Soviet system, sent tens of thousands to hell of a concentration camp, believing he was doing good. Evil can be masked to the point that people don't see the evil. And the real evil in the world is where some individuals have excessive power over other individuals and they rob them of their most divine right, that is the right to make free choices concerning their own affairs. There's two aspects of the corrupting question. A lot of people can see, yes, I can see what you are saying, Mr. Butler, that power does corrupt. The government's got too much power. Certainly Mr. Keating's got too much power and he wants even more. I can see that, but what they miss is there's another aspect of the corruption. Power not only corrupts those who are using it, it corrupts those over whom it is used. So if you allow yourself to become the passive tool of someone else's decisions, you are becoming corrupted. You are no longer making decisions for yourself. And regretfully, today we see many manifestations of that. The old traditional Christian objection to drunkenness is rather interesting. The objection wasn't on health grounds, because a lot of other things we do that are much worse than consuming alcohol. No, the objection was the individual had sinned because he lost control of himself. And there's the famous English bishop who said he'd rather see all the people drunk as long as they were free. At least they'd be making free judgments concerning what they were about. Freedom. As I was saying at a seminar over the weekend, I don't think too many people have fully grasped the real significance of freedom. Free choice, which means the individual becomes further developed by using it. It's rather like a muscle. If you don't exercise that muscle, the muscle atrophies. It becomes corrupted. So every concentration of power, irrespective of the label, is corrupting to the people over the hemisphere. That's a major part of our problem today. And there's little doubt, of course, those who lived under the naked totalitarian systems have been more corrupt than everyone else, and the problem is how are they going to regenerate themselves, as witnessed by the post-Soviet system. What is going to happen? And the big problem is people become so corrupted by decisions being made for them, the difficulty is for them to take personal responsibility, use their initiative to do things for themselves. These are certain realities I'd suggest we keep firmly in mind as we look at these ideas as they manifest themselves throughout history. In more recent times, we've seen another manifestation of these ideas with what you've all heard about, the New World Order. Now, that term New World Order is rather misleading because it suggests, well, this is a completely new idea. It's not new at all, it's a very old idea. You can go right back to the famous Greek philosophers, particularly Plato, very distinguished, influenced large numbers of people, and, might I say, still influences them today. What Plato taught, in essence, was that if elitists like himself, what he called them philosopher kings, if we had the power to make all the decisions, we could plan the perfect world order. Plato. That idea is with us today, only in a more dramatic form. So it's not a new idea at all, it's a very old idea. Very interesting if you look at the controversies between Plato and his great friend and student, Aristotle, a different point of view altogether. Not without significance that the early Christian church drew more heavily on Aristotle did upon Plato. For example, Aristotle drew attention to the fallacy of collective ownership, pointing out collective ownership meant of anything, individuals did not feel any sense of responsibility. And so, of course, you have all the problems with that. So over the centuries, these ideas have manifested themselves in different forms. But running through it all has been this question of how do we get that power? Do, in most cases, good. Sincerely believing that's the way to go. And that brings me quickly down to what we'll call modern times, when you can see a manifestation of these ideas in a different form. So, to give a starting point, we go to a very interesting movement, generally known as the Illuminati. Now, the Illuminati did exist. It doesn't exist only in the imagination of people. It's not like some of these other documents you hear about or theories you have about conspiracies and secret societies, because, of course, in Bavaria, the documents concerning this society were seized and made public. That, of course, was just prior to the French Revolution. Now, what was the essence of what this movement was about? Well, first you had the old idea of Plato. If a group of elitists, those who'd been illuminated with a deeper understanding, if they had the knowledge and the power, how they could change society. Their ideas were rather interesting. First of all, the idea of the elitists controlling everyone else, but you had to eliminate the accepted natural order of things. For example, private ownership of property was an evil to be got rid of. Not without significance. Monarchy, particularly Christian monarchy, was a very bad idea according to the Illuminati. The family had to be broken up. And that society put together a framework of activities which are interesting in view of what has taken place since. stress was on secrecy. The structure of the whole operation so that you had the initiatives coming through, lower up to higher, and those in the lower orders didn't know what the higher orders were doing. A tremendous practical example of the creation of what we call the secret society, the Illuminati. The mastermind was that famous figure, Adam Weishaupt. And again, if you're going to draw attention to Shakespeare's statement, the evil that men do lives after them, well, it's certainly the evil he spoke about has lived a long time after, and he's gone. And I might say, Mr. Chairman, as far as I know, I've seen no evidence that convinces me that the Illuminati today has any type of organisation. There's no structure. You can't say, well, there's a formal movement. But what I can say is the ideas that were advanced then have continued on in different forms under different labels. And so, for example, they preach, not only as I've said, the abolition of property, religion, and also nationalism against nationalism. They stressed what they called the God of reason. The God of reason. The stress on logic. Well, logic's got its place in the human drama, but logic's merely like a slide rule. And all you can get from the slide rule is what's fed into it. And if you don't feed in some of the factors, the logic can be impeccable, you don't get the total picture. The age of reason. The age of logic. And so we came to that awful event, the first great manifestation of the breakdown of Western Christian civilization in France. The French Revolution of 1789. One of the most significant comments about the French Revolution comes from Lord Acton in his essay, where he said the appalling and disturbing thing about the French Revolution is not all the smoke and the confusion, the convulsion, the destruction, was the evidence of clear design behind it. Design. In other words, Acton accepted that ideas can find a concrete form under different labels. And the French Revolution, all those ideas, paved the way for the next manifestation of these ideas under another label. And it quickly brings us to a chap called Karl Marx. Very interesting, Karl Marx's history, his background. Important to note, first and foremost, he was what you'd call well-educated. University product. He didn't come out of the trade union movement. He didn't start as a peasant. His education was what you call the higher level. And there, of course, he was captured for these types of ideas. And ultimately, he became very, very acceptable to people that were advancing these ideas. And he put them into a concrete form in 1848 with a document called Communist Manifesto. If you'll read through the Communist Manifesto and then go back and look at the Illuminati, you'll see a very striking resemblance. In fact, go right away back 2,000 years to Plato. In his writings, you'll see exactly the same idea. All you've done is change the label. I want to stress this, you don't change reality by putting different labels on it. That's one of the most important ideas that you can think about. Because we're all so confused because we've got a government that's got an anti-communist, anti-socialist label on it. Well, then it must be different from those that are labeled socialist. I want to stress that. You do not change the nature of reality by giving it a different description. I give this rather mundane example to find one of the schools that I run to try and make this point in my part of the world, in my younger days, where we still do run some sheep. One of our big problems at lambing time is foxes. I hope no one reports me to the animal liberationists about this, but we use a certain type of poison the bait called strychnine. You bought it from the chemist, that's when you could. You can't buy it anymore. And generally it was in a pink powder form. Now I want to tell you, if you look at it, you could be forgiven, if you didn't know, mistaking that for icing sugar. But I can assure you, if you label that bottle icing sugar, not strychnine, and took a teaspoon of it, the results would be different. You've changed reality by changing the label. So I don't care what the label on a government is, if that government's got excessive power, you'll get the same deadly results, irrespective of what you label. Think about that, because it's important in the struggle in which we're engaged today. During last century, that turbulent period, Western Europe was shaken, the aftermath, the French Revolution. The British escaped much of this because they tenaciously did cling, and they had some natural leaders who kept stressing their constitutional roots, and their value system gave them some protection against this. Very important part of history. While the whole of Western Europe, apart from Britain, was being shaken. And if you'll read the novels of the famous British Prime Minister, Disraeli, Coningsby and many others, he talks of the secret societies that were shaking Western civilization, the ferment against the established order, against established religion, and all that Western Europe had stood for, the secret society, all their operating. Because these ideas were fermented, and through this was coming the ideas of Marxism. These ideas found, interestingly, a very strong expression in Germany. I want to just stress this because the German factor is a very important part of the history of our civilization. Now, most people overlook the fact that great contributions, and they have been enormous, of the Germans to what we'll call culture and civilization were when Germany consisted of decentralized independent states. But you see, you had a man called Bismarck who felt that it'd be better if you got all the power centralized. And he had some very interesting allies. And they were the followers of Karl Marx, the socialists. And so you get that famous statement, two movements apparently quite different. One, I suppose, in modern terminology called some right-wing fellow called Bismarck, and over here the socialists. But nevertheless, the famous statement put it, we march separately, but we march together towards the same objective. The centralization of power. And the centralization of power had a deadly effect on the German people. Manifests itself in so many ways. Their education system. They pioneered what we call the modern welfare system. Even went into so much of what you call progressive education. Which, without being too critical, Queen Victoria's consort brought a lot of those ideas to England with him. Including, if you don't know, the idea of the kindergarten. The kindergarten, get the kids as early as you can. That idea is very prevalent, as you know, today. And that did have a tremendous effect on the character of the German people. And made them a very convenient tool for those who could manipulate. And so as we see what's happening today, that factor is still there, and it's going to be one of the explosive factors in this tremendous drama that's unfolding. These are the ideas. Now, the British were fortunate, being isolated, not only geographically, but also in every other way, managed to maintain a different concept. And it was in that situation that a group of these people advocating these ideas said, well, look, the British are never ever going to accept what perhaps the Continentals will accept. The whole of their constitutional background is so different. The character of the people is different. So they won't accept that. So what we need is a different set of tactics. And out of that was born what's called the Fabian idea, which emerged in a concrete form, 1883, 84. And if you look at those who formed it, please note, although the term socialism was used, there were no working class there. They were all what we'll call intellectuals. And they all knew what was best for everyone else. Very self-opinionated. I suppose one of the most influential, that man who's had such a big influence on many people, George Burnett Shaw. I wonder how many of those hundreds of thousands have gone to see the stage play based upon Shaw's famous play, Pygmalion, My Fair Lady. Perhaps stood in the bath in the morning singing some of the ditties from it, have realised that if you'll study that very closely, it's a very insidious attack on the institution of the family. In other words, his tremendous talents were being used for what is called permeation, not confrontation, permeation. And if you'll read through Shaw's very cynical and frank writings, he tells you exactly how they went about it. In other words, they said, look, it's no good talking about revolution here in Britain, no good talking of storming Buckingham Palace or the House of Commons. The British people, an orderly sort of a people, they won't accept this at all. We have to have a different approach, a completely different approach. So they used the term Fabian, very interesting. The term, of course, going back to that Roman general. Gradual permeation. And we have a very, I think, very effective description of it, provided very kindly for us by our former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. Because of the centenary dinner in Melbourne of the Fabian Society, that's 1984, in the Melbourne Town Hall. You had thousands at that dinner, some of the most interesting people in this country. Naturally, of course, Mr. Gough Whitlam, he was there. The late Mr. Justice Murphy was there. These were what you might call from the higher levels of our society, in the key positions. And that's exactly what the Illuminati taught. You must permeate into key positions in society. And that's what, of course, has taken place. And of course, Bob Hawke gave you a very, very brilliant description of the Fabian program and how it works. How we must change the whole nature, the character, the whole philosophy of appeal. In other words, not concentrating so much on winning elections, that was important, but changing for all time the way people think. It's all there. Now the fact that he's gone, it's no relevance, because again, the evil that men do lives afterwards. Continues on, that disease. And so now we have Mr. Keating, and he's simply continuing with those ideas. Whether he's an active member of the Fabian Society, doesn't matter. The fact is he's continuing that program on, those set of ideas. And the Fabians, therefore, started with that approach. They even saw the importance of the high-sounding education, so they established the London School of Economics. Might I say, this is very important, financed by rather wealthy individuals, wealthy people, the Rothschilds and others. In other words, you had a combination of these kinds of people. The fact that some were bankers, financiers, and the others were other kinds of people, didn't make any difference. They were all imbued with the same approach, the London School of Economics. And there we'll bring students from all over the old English-speaking world, and we'll indoctrinate them under the guise of teaching economics. And they can go back. And then they'll influence governments. And they did that. Even the Americans. John F. Kennedy, the present president. Clinton is a product of that type of influence this case coming through Oxford and the Rhodes movement, the Rhodes scholarship, where those ideas were permeated there. And so he might be offended if you call him a Fabian, but the fact is he's got that disease, badly got it. And that's the way they started. People should read what George Bernard Shaw had to say. We permeated. We joined all the political parties, including the Conservative Party. And I love that statement of his. We put ideas into the heads of even Conservatives who never knew where they were coming from and what they're about. And they would never have been there if we hadn't put them there. Permeation. The Fabian approach. A very old approach, but very, very deadly. And that has permeated all our political parties. That disease. We're starting to see manifestations of that in this country at the moment. You know, some people have been quite shocked. After the last elections, and suddenly Mr. Keating announced we're going to become a republic, we're going to start the debate, and suddenly they discovered that about half the members of the Liberal Party seem to at least subscribe to it, or perhaps we would discuss it. In my part of the world, we've got a former Liberal Premier, knighted, Sir Rupert Hayner, come out quite public and said he thinks we should move to a republic. I don't know why he doesn't hand his knighthood back. He's at least honest about it. The disease has been there all the time. Over the years, some of us for our sins have tried to point this out. We were told you're extreme. That's a very extreme view. But now you're seeing, at least to that extent, I believe the last elections produced a result which brought this into the open. We can all see it now. In other words, the poison was there all the time, working through the body politic. It's now come right into the open. And I think and hope more people can now see that so we can deal with the poison. That's a step forward, at least. The Fabian concept then right through teaching economics, collectivism, and much else. It ran out here to Australia during the Second World War. We had as our Attorney General Dr. Herbert V. Rivet, the man who tried to tear the Constitution up, used a crisis. First of all, to try and stampede the states into handing the power to the federal government. And he would have got away with it, hadn't it been for one government, just one, and one part of that government down in Little Tasmania. Every other state, including the so-called Conservatives, well, perhaps it's inevitable like today, and after all, we'll get the powers back after the war, and what's wrong with it? Except when it reached Tasmania. And the lower house there, they agreed, yes, well, we'll go along with it, but it reached their upper house, the Legislative Council, and you had a few Australians of integrity, and they said, no, the Australian people should be consulted about a revolutionary program like this, and we are not going to endorse it. Perhaps there's some significance that the key figure down there, or one of the key figures, was a chap who was a very famous cricketer. Perhaps he did understand what cricket used to be all about, famous Joe Darling. Bert Ebbett went down and tried to talk Darling into it, said, well, I'm a great cricket lover. I understand Darling said, well, it's a pity you didn't understand the rules and spirit of the game and you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. That's right, to do it. As a result of that, of course, we had to have the 1944 referendum. And when the people had a say, they rejected the whole concept completely, simply because of a few people, just a few, that stood firm. Now, that's important to understand at the moment, because it's those that are going to stand firm that are going to turn the tide. The few that stand firm. So we have that manifestation. And of course, he was a great friend of Professor Harold Jarrett Laskin, famous theoretician of the London School of Economics. He's the man who went to Moscow after the Second World War, had a long talk with Joe Stalin, and at the end of it said this, well, it's quite clear we're all marching to the same objective, but we're on different roads. So Joe Stalin's on the Marxist-Leninist road, we're on the Fabian road, but we're all marching to the same objective. Very revealing statement. Other strategies were evolved. During the 30s, for example, we had the sort of forerunner of what we're seeing today, when in England a movement called Political and Economic Planning emerged, BEP, and said the only way to deal with the economic crisis, believe this or not, was economic rationalism. That sounds familiar? We need economic rationalism. We've got to get rid of these inefficient small units, and we've got to rationalise all the rest into bigger units that'll be then more efficient. The PEP. Interesting, some of the patrons, Mr. Israel Moses Sif, great chain store monopoly, he was a great advocate of this, because that got rid of all the small stores, he felt it worked. Political and economic planning. You had support of top financiers. You had an association then, again, of people with different labels that all went into the same idea. Well, the organisation called Political and Economic Planning, as far as I know, no longer exists. It no longer exists, but the ideas it put forward still exist. That's what I'm saying to you. So it doesn't matter if they fold up formally the Fabian Society straight tomorrow. Don't throw your hat in the air and say, that's marvellous. If those ideas persist, perhaps in a different form, different labels, then the problem's even greater than when we did have it in the open. One of the earlier Fabians was attracted to it, but broke with it, was a man called H.G. Wells, the great novelist and writer. And he wrote some most devastating critiques of how the Fabians worked, pointing out it was all very devious and tricky and slimy. And of course he referred to Sidney Webb, it's a Webby type of move, that he wrote a great novel about it. But the fact that formally that structure may no longer exist doesn't mean these ideas no longer exist. They simply have emerged or developed with different labels. Now, one of the most revealing statements that H.G. Wells made was that big business is simply the higher road to the same objective that the squared socialist is taking, going to the same objective. A most revealing statement, because that's what's happening today, isn't it? You're seeing that, the amalgamation of big business, big government, and now, of course, the idea of big unions too, with everybody else pushed out. That idea found expression in Italy under another label altogether. It was called fascism, the corporate state. The corporate state is what is emerging. And you've got the leading advocates of in all political parties at Canberra at the present time. I come from Victoria, where of course we've got Mr. Jeff Kennett. And there's little doubt we agree that the Kerner government was disastrous, but Mr. Kennett's even more disastrous because he's continuing the program under the mask, we're more responsible. He's just been round the world calling on those who make it possible for you to increase your indebtedness in this country. And what he's saying to all these people, you can lend to Victoria now with great confidence because we are more responsible managers. See, we are liberal. We're not socialist, we're liberal. The same disease. I might say at the same time he's doing something that our Fabian socialist friends in Victoria couldn't get away with, mainly because the Australian League of Rights led a tremendous campaign against us, a campaign to amalgamate municipal government in Victoria. Now, our friends in this case, the Fabians, went about it because they had a former communist. The minister, he went about it too directly. He said, we're going to get rid of 2/3 of your municipal governments who will amalgamate the rest of the big region. It'll be much more efficient. There was a tremendous upsurge of opposition. The League led, and that was defeated. But now the anti-socialist, Mr. Kennett, he's got the same program, but he's using different tactics. So he's starting with some of the big cities, such as down in Geelong. We'll have a bigger Geelong, a greater Geelong. Then if we can establish it there, we'll go to Ballarat. We'll establish it there, then up to Bendigo, and then having established it, then we can spread out and persuade the rest to amalgamate under the guise of anti-socialism. That is why we've got to keep our eyes on the ball all the time, and the difference between labels on ideas and the ideas themselves and the program. That is why what I call Fabianism, the Fabian idea, is very much alive today. It hasn't gone away at all. It's merely manifesting itself in a different form. In fact, it's now manifesting itself internationally, with the teaching that if we can only now establish these great regional blocks, free trade areas, they can all be put together and we can finish with Plato's ideal of the world state. And you've got departments of the United Nations and elsewhere, stacked with all these people that come out of educational systems, all convinced that all wisdom was born with them and they can run the world. The moment they're in the Soviet Union, so what was the Soviet Union? What are they doing there? Well, they're allegedly reconstructing. And who's doing the reconstructing? They've got, at the moment, it's reading a dramatic report, they've got thousands of officials of the International Monetary Fund in the Soviet Union advising how to reconstruct Russia. The reconstruction is simply an extension of the old idea, which was so crude it broke down, but in a new form. And so they're saying to the Russians, now what you've got to do, under the guise of something called the free market, very few people, and you get that slogan thrown at you, the free market, the market economy. What is a market and who controls the market? Well, let me just say simply, a market is simply a number of people with money in their pockets. And whoever controls how much money they got in their pockets controls the market. And that is why the whole subject of the debt system, now being mobilised internationally, is absolutely essential to an understanding of what is taking place. We're being mobilised now globally, or the attempt to mobilise us globally, extending those ideas. So we finish, theoretically, with the world state. Now, there are problems about this, of course. Reality keeps breaking out. The multicultural society doesn't seem to work very well, as witnessed by what's happening in Yugoslavia, what's going to happen, or is happening in South Africa, and elsewhere. But these people are so mad in the sense they're divorced from reality. They say, in essence, if only we can get a little more power, we can solve the problem. In other words, like in Alice in Wonderland, where the Red Queen says, faster, faster, faster. We've got to run harder. A long time ago, there was a very wise man. That's why I constantly go back. I think we've got to draw on the wisdom of the past. His name was Confucius. I think what he had to say has got some relevance today. He said, what's the use of running even harder if you're already on the wrong road? You simply get to the end of the road and everybody else. We've got a confusion between means and ends, as witnessed by this manifestation of this idea of bigness and centralisation. We need more and more growth, more and more capital goods, more production. Completely overlooking the fact, well, what's the production about? So I want to tell you a little story that I think will be of interest to you. I was reminded of this the other day because I was looking at some of the old masters of English literature, and particularly those of the period when they used to write the essays. And one famous essayist, of course, I used to study and went to school, was Charles Lamb. Charles Lamb wrote a fascinating little essay on the discovery of roast pork. I think it's got a great relevance to our position. You see, at that period, as he explains, Chinese had never eaten roast pork. Pigs were looked after. And in this story, little Lu Pong, whatever his name was, he was left at home this day to look after the pigs. And he burnt the place down. And he was in great shock. But then as he tried to come to grips with it, there's this new smell, the smell of roast pork. And then by accident, his fingers touched it, and then he licked it. Oh, Mom. Roast pork. And then his father came home, and after he built him, his son said to him, "It looked marvellous, and he tasted it. But don't tell him the name of his daughter." And then they noticed in that community a very interesting phenomenon. Every time this family's pig, the whole place went up in flames. And then the whole countryside started to go up, because people felt this was the only way to get this new delicacy called roast pork. You burnt the whole place down. That's what we're doing today. Burning the whole place down to get what we really do want. The consumer goods which we can get without tearing the place down, without doing all these things. I think we've got to go back and look at some of the wisdom of the past, some of those stories which I think have got a great deal of relevance. Because we're clearly on the road to disaster. And that brings us, before I conclude, into where we are at the moment with Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating, of course, is really in the mould of the Illuminati. He dislikes the idea of monarchy, particularly anything that comes from Britain, because he's anti-British. But monarchy itself. He seems to believe the idea of monarchy is contrary to something he calls democracy. But you've got to look at democracy. There's some pretty scathing comments about how it works. I see the Prime Minister of Malaysia, I don't know if we completely agree with him, he said democracy as practiced in other countries is a disaster. It leads to homosexuality, which you all worship apparently, because that's the way to go. Promiscuity and the whole breakdown of society. Well, he said, we don't have that, not yet here in Malaysia. We don't think this democratic idea is the way to go. We've got to look at all this. Mr. Keating's got that collectivist mania, and he believes if we can make things bigger, we can make them better. If we can get ourselves absorbed into something called the Asian sphere, we'll solve our problems here. But it's the debt system that's being used to drive us. The debt system all the time. And the significant thing about the debt system is, it wouldn't have mattered if we'd elected John Hewson at the last elections, because the debt under John Hewson, his projections, would have been nearly the same as those under Mr. Keating. But now they tell us don't worry about that. That's simply a measure of our progress and our development. But in essence, they are proposing this country be torn from its roots. Torn from its roots, its cultural roots, historic roots, to fit us into this grandiose plan, this idea. I would say that a man like Adam Weishaupt must be cheering in his grave as he sees my idea being taken up with such vigour right around the world. Surely it's true, the evil that men do lives after. And the world we have today is a world in which ideas like this are evil. And I don't care what label you put on them, their results are deadly. And so, Mr. Chairman, as we look at these ideas, they work themselves out in history. We can see that we don't change reality, they're putting different labels on it. Reality, in the last analysis, is the great disciplinarian. You can keep jumping over the cliff if you like, perhaps pretending you're so well educated you won't come to any harm, or you're being liberated, or something else. I can assure you, reality will overtake it. And that is where I believe we are at the moment. And perhaps the encouraging aspect of our position is that we can see, if we will look behind the labels, behind the veneer, we can see that there is a solution, in the sense we are violating absolutes. The absolutes are still there. What we've got to do is to humble ourselves enough to admit these absolutes are greater than we are, and if we'll simply rediscover them, go back, rediscover them, and apply them, we can start to regenerate our nation. That's where I believe we are at this moment. Tremendous challenge, but a challenge which we must face, or we're simply going to die. And finally, we've been given some leadership. by that man whom the media is trying to denigrate all the time. His name is Prince Charles. That is why people should read what he has to say, his essays. And what a courageous individual he was to go to France right at the moment when these people, the big planners, were trying to get this general agreement on trade and tariffs into place and beat those French down so that they'd agreed they had to go away so that you could have all this big structure in America flooding in. And Prince Charles arrives to say, in essence, something that's been said a long time ago: you can gain the whole world and lose your soul. And said if you're going to destroy all these small French peasants, you destroy the culture. You destroy the soul of the nation. And that was absolute anathema. Something. That is why I believe perhaps when we look at one representative monarchy, it's far preferable to, shall we say, four kings. Thank you very much.
That's a very interesting thing. If you study the literature concerning the development of what I call these subversive ideas, going back to White Ops and the Illuminati, the attack on nationalism, the undermining of belief in nationalism, and in the famous Canadian spy trials where all of those involved were so-called elitists, well-educated, but really basically traitors, they had experienced what you in essence are suggesting. Their fibre had been rotted. They no longer believed in loyalty to their own nation. They were internationalists, therefore they had no roots. I think that's the real issue. Now, we've got to have faith here and hope enough people, and the evidence is they're trying to find their way back to the roots. And the only way we can help other people to do that, by encouraging them, is to do that ourselves. That is why I think we've got to concentrate on ourselves, quoting Shakespeare, and again, to thine own self be true. Thou canst not then be false from any man. We've got to be sympathetic to all these other people, but it's examples. People are inspired and learn from examples, not from lectures, and you can point these things out, but by example. We're, I believe, better placed than most to do that, to go back to our roots and preach that, and that's where we're going to go. Boldly reject internationalism. Boldly reject multiculturalism as it's presented to us. And say, right, it's great that if the Germans go back to their roots, the French go back to their roots, all these people, the Russians go back to their roots, but they're only going to be inspired to the extent they will be inspired by example. And that is why at a certain period in European history, continental Europe was inspired by the example of the British. They looked to the British because the British kept themselves free. And they looked to them. And I believe perhaps that's the role that we can play today. That means we've got to lift our game. We've got to get back to that old teaching that a nation without vision perishes. We've got to have a vision. But the vision's got to be related back to reality. I completely agree with you.